The Green Mile is a 1999 American fantasy drama movie which follows an innocent black man who gets wrongfully convicted of assaulting and murdering two young girls. The story takes an interesting turn when the prison guards find out that John possesses special healing powers. The movie begins in 1999 with an elderly Paul Edgecombe living in a nursing home, reminiscing about his time working at the prison. He is reflecting on his past as a prison guard in Louisiana. He tells his friend Elaine about a particular inmate named John Coffey, who was on death row for the murder of two young girls. Paul then begins to tell Elaine the story of how he and his fellow guards met John Coffey. The film flashes back to 1935, when Paul is the head guard of the Cold Mountain Penitentiary, nicknamed the Green Mile. His team includes Brutus Howell, Percy Terwilliger, and Dean Stanton. One day, a new inmate named John Coffey arrives in the prison. John is a mild-mannered black man who is sentenced to death after being convicted of assaulting and murdering two young white girls. John is a huge, muscular man, but he seems gentle and kind. He exhibits a childlike shyness and nervousness on his face, which seems odd. On his first night at the jail, John asks Paul if he can sleep with the lights on because he is terrified of the dark. He also extends his hand to shake hands with Paul, which was uncharacteristic of a murderer. But just as Paul was about to close the door, the huge man bursts into tears and says, "There's nothing I can do, sir. I wanted to save them, but it's too late." Paul is intrigued by John and his gentle nature, so he reads the file on John's case. He reads that the family was distressed to find their two daughters missing. The father of the missing girls was desperately searching for his daughters when he found their toys out in the middle of a jungle. And that's when he heard a man shout. He, along with a group of men, followed the sound and found John holding the two missing girls and crying out in pain. The father immediately started attacking John and the others had to stop him. Later, a police officer questions John, who replies, "I couldn't help himself and wanted to give it back, but it was too late." And then John was arrested for the murder of those girls. Hearing this story, Paul feels extremely uncomfortable and can't believe the gruesome crime that John committed. That night, Paul talks to his wife and tells her about John, the crime he committed, and the very unusual nature of John. Next day, the prison guards find a mouse roaming around the prison cell hallway. After taking a bite of a biscuit, the mouse enters the prison restraint room. The prison guards then decide to get rid of the house and open the restraint room. They take all the things out of the room but fail to find the mouse. Hours later, the mouse appears again, and this time prison guard Percy spots it. He quickly takes his baton out and starts attacking the poor mouse. Percy is hell-bent on trying to kill the mouse, but yet again the mouse makes its escape to the restraint room. He empties the restraint room in an effort to find the mouse. But just like the other guards, Percy fails to find the mouse. Next day, Paul conducts a rehearsal of an electronic execution they're going to oversee. They take an inmate for the rehearsal, and during all this, Percy questions why a wet sponge is put on top of the inmate's head. A fellow officer then replies that it helps conduct the electricity directly to the brain, making the execution quick and not so painful for the inmates. After the rehearsal is completed, inmate Arlen Bitterbuck is prepared for his execution. During his final hours, Arlen has a deep conversation about his life with Paul, who tries to keep himself from showing any emotion. When it's time, Arlen is taken to the execution room, and with an audience full of people, Arlen is given electric shock. When the doctor checks on him, he says that Arlen is still not dead, which means that he'll get the shock again. Officer Brutus hesitantly calls for a second round of electric shock on Arlen, and this time Arlen is dead. Following the execution, Percy bad-mouths the dead body of Arlen, which doesn't sit well with Brutus, who commands Percy to pay no disrespect to the dead. Later, Paul asks Percy why he hasn't taken the job at the hospital, which pays more than being a prison guard. To this, Percy replies that he'll take the hospital job once he gets to execute an inmate. It is evident that Percy is sadistic and takes pleasure in seeing the prisoners get hurt and executed. Days later, John and his team find prisoner Edgeworth Delacroix with the same mouse they were trying to find days earlier. They see that Edgeworth has made the mouse his pet and has even taught it some tricks. Edgeworth has grown really fond of the mouse and has named it Mr. Jingles. Later, Paul goes to meet prison warden Hal Moores, who sadly reveals that his wife was diagnosed with tumor, which the doctors have concluded to be untreatable. Warden Hall is really depressed by this news and doesn't know how he'll tell his wife about her deadly disease. But it's not only Warden Hall's wife who's suffering from a disease. Paul himself has a urinary infection, which gives him unbearable pain and trouble urinating. The following day, while trying to enter a new inmate named William in his cell, Dean gets caught by the prisoner, after which Paul aims his gun. Meanwhile, Percy just stands, still afraid to do anything to save his colleague. Brutus arrives just in time to save Dean and gets the situation in control. After this, Paul is left alone in the prison hall, where he starts to experience excruciating pain due to his urinary infection. John sees Paul in pain, and so he asks Paul to come near him. Hesitant, Paul goes near John's cell, after which John aggressively grabs hold of Paul and starts touching him. Paul attempts to take his gun out but stops when he feels something unusual happening. Seconds later, John lets go of Paul and starts coughing. A swarm of flies come flying out of John's mouth, and John claims that he took Paul's pain away and is now tired. Right after John goes to sleep, Paul goes into the bathroom and is relieved to find he has no trouble urinating and feels no pain at all. John had truly taken away Paul's pain and had healed him. After realizing that John has the power of healing, Paul goes and tells his wife about him. Paul simply couldn't have committed a heinous crime, so he goes to meet John's lawyer, Bert Hammersmith, who fought in defense of John in the court. Paul asks if the police were able to find any previous history of crime against John. But Bert reveals that the police didn't find anything on John, not even his personal history. Bert comments that John almost came out of the sky and thus had no records to his name. During the conversation, Paul realizes that Bert Hammersmith is racist and he had no intention to free John. Bert Hammersmith truly believed that John had committed the crimes. Next day, Paul takes some food to John as a thank you for healing him. Instead of taking all the food for him, John decides to give some to Edgeworth and Mr. Jingles. Meanwhile, William Morton is giving a really tough time to the prison guards as he disrespects Paul by spitting on his face and doesn't take the prison authorities seriously. So in order to teach him a lesson, the prison guards lock him away in the restraint room. Days later, William apologizes and is finally let out. But he was only lying and he kept harassing the guards. So he's once again locked in the restraint room. He eventually grabs hold of Percy, who gets shit scared. William lets go of him and claims he was only joking. But Williams makes some comments on Percy and says he wants to sleep with him. Hearing this, Percy gets even more scared and even pisses his pants. Embarrassed by this, Percy threatens everyone not to talk about it to anyone or else he'd get everyone fired. But Edgeworth, who was always bullied by Percy, keeps on laughing. As a revenge for this, Percy later steps on Miss Jingles and walks away. Seeing his pet mouse on the verge of death, Edgeworth breaks into tears. Just then, John asks for the mouse and says he might just be able to save its life. Paul hands Mr. Jingles to John, who begins to do his healing in front of the prison guards. Just as the last time, a swarm of flies come out of John's mouth, and Miss Jingles is healed completely, as if nothing had happened. The prison guards are moved by this sight, and they realize that John has a special power of healing. A few days later, it's Edgeworth's time for execution, so he asks Paul to take care of Miss Jingles from then on. But Paul can't take Miss Jingles to the execution room, so John offers to keep him until the execution is over. Edgeworth is then taken and tied to the electrocution chair, where he apologizes for his crimes and wishes he never had committed them. Just as the other prison guards were getting emotional, Percy tells Edgeworth that no one is going to take care of Mr. Jingles after his death, making Edgeworth even more sad. When it's time to wet the sponge, Percy only pretends to dip the sponge in the bucket and puts the dry sponge on Edgeworth's head. He then calls for Edgeworth's electric execution, and as the sponge on Edgeworth's head is dry, Edgeworth gets electrocuted all over his body. Paul and the others realize that the sponge is dry, but it's too late for them to do anything. Edgeworth's whole body catches fire, and he gets burned to death. Percy tries to watch away, but Paul forces him to see what he had caused. Following Edgeworth's horrifying death, Brutus can't help but punch Percy. When Wardenhall arrives and questions what happened, Percy just replies that he didn't know the sponge was supposed to be wet. Paul then reminds Percy that he now has to leave the prison guard job and take the hospital job just as he had promised. Paul later returns to the cell and finds John crying at the loss of Edgeworth. One day, Paul takes his wife to the warden's house where they meet his wife. The warden's wife happens to be ill, and the warden seems depressed due to his wife's ailment. Looking at his suffering companion, Paul thinks of an extremely ambitious plan. He tells his team that he wants to take John and let him heal Wardenhall's wife. The team think that sneaking John out of the prison will be dangerous for their job. But in order to save Wardenhall's wife, they agree to do it. As part of their plan, they spike William's drink, which knocks him out for the night. And as for Percy, they put him in a straitjacket and lock him in the restraint room. With that taken care of, the group try to sneak John out of the prison. But before that, William grabs John's hand, after which John gets some vision regarding William's crimes and sins. Paul takes William's hands away from John and proceeds with his plan. As John comes out of the prison, he's happy and joyful as a child, seeing the night stars and feeling the earth on his feet. John is then driven to the warden's house, where Warden Hall is surprised to see his team and John. Warden Hall is uncomfortable seeing his prisoner out in the open, but John slowly walks up to him and says he can help him. John then approaches Warden Hall's wife, who gets horrified, as if she was possessed by an evil entity. John sits silently in front of the woman. John speaks to her politely and then lowers his head slowly, fairly close to her. All of a sudden, the light in the room brightens. White lights emerge from the woman's mouth, all of which is sucked out of her body by John. The wall clock bursts, the room shakes, and the miracle occurs yet again. Suddenly, the woman's face returns to its normal color and she is healed. Seeing his wife healed and saved, Warden Hall moves in tears. The woman then gets out of her bed and tells John that she had seen him in her dreams. She then takes her necklace off and gives it to John as a present. One thing that didn't go as usual as before is that instead of letting the flies out of his mouth, John decides to swallow them back into his body. Later, a tired and exhausted John is taken back to the prison and is let to rest. Paul and Brutus then talk to Percy and let him out under the condition he's finally going to quit the prison guard job and keep his mouth shut. As soon as Percy gets out, he gets caught by John, who finally lets the swarm of flies out, which instantly go into Percy's mouth. Percy then looks possessed and out of his senses. He coldly walks up to William's cell and shoots him to death. Paul and his team quickly take Percy under their control, after which the swarm of flies come out of Percy's mouth and fly away. Paul then goes to John and asks why he had the flies take control of Percy and let him kill William. John replies that when William caught his hand, he saw a vision where William assaulted and killed 2 young girls, the same girls which John was convicted of murdering. John then holds Paul's hands and gives him his power. With this power, Paul sees what exactly William had done. Turns out William was the one who committed the heinous crime, and John was only trying to bring the girls back to life. That's why John let the flies use Percy, who already was a bad man, to kill another bad man. Meanwhile, Percy is unable to come to his senses, and as a result is sent to a mental ward. At home, Paul talks to his wife and tells her about the dilemma he is in. He knows for certain that John is innocent, but he can't do anything to save him from execution. Paul doesn't know what to do in this situation. With John's execution date approaching, Paul talks to John and asks if he wants to escape from the prison. Paul says that he's afraid of letting John die. Paul says if he lets his execution go through, he doesn't know how he'll face God. That's why Paul wants to help John escape. However, John replies that he doesn't want to escape. He's simply tired of living, worrying, and experiencing the pain in his life. He wants to go through with his execution and get done with it. Brutus then asks if John has a last wish that he wants to fulfill. John replies that he has never seen a movie before. To fulfill his last wish, John is led to watch a movie. Days later, it's John's execution date. John is taken to the execution room, where the audience member includes the parents of the deceased girls that John was trying to revive. John feels extremely nervous looking at the faces of people who seem to hate him. When it's time to put the mask over his face, John pleads with Paul to not use the mask as he's really afraid of the dark. Paul respects John's wish and tells his team to not use the mask. He then puts the wet sponge on top of John's head and prepares for the final blow. Before Paul calls for the execution, he approaches John, shakes his hand, and nods him goodbye. John is then electrocuted to death, and the prison guards, who knew how pure and innocent John really was, can't help but cry out. Back in the present, Paul tells his friend that John's execution was the last execution he ever took part in. Following John's death, Paul quit his job, and so did his teammate Brutus. Hearing this story, Paul's friend Elaine can't help but think it's a fictional story. So Paul takes her to an old abandoned house in the jungle. Inside the house, John shows Elaine a small box, out of which a mouse shows up. And it's none other than Mr. Jingles, who John saved years ago. Paul then reveals that Mr. Jingles was able to live a long life, all thanks to John's power of healing. And moreover, the power that John passed on to Paul made him live a long, healthy life as well. Paul believes his long life is a curse for letting John die, as he has had to see his friends and loved ones die, while he has lived a very long life. And the movie ends with Elaine's funeral, while Paul continues to live on, alongside Shingles. Thank you so much for watching till the end. I hope you really enjoyed this beautiful movie. Let us know in the comments section about your thoughts on the movie. Don't forget to like this video, and before you leave, subscribe to the channel for more movie recaps.